Hello, Regulation Theory students. Dr. Conway here for Lesson 9 on Compliance Promotion. A very important topic because we know through the narrative of our course thus far that one of the primary objectives of well-designed regulation, well-consulted regulation, regulation based on expertise and information, in other words, regulation based on high levels of public legitimacy, tend towards high levels of voluntary compliance, which all good regulatory processes want, right? High levels of voluntary compliance. But to get high levels of voluntary compliance, you need to have, it's more than just putting the regulation on the books and publishing it in Gazette 2. There's ongoing compliance promotion activities that need to take place to maintain high levels of voluntary compliance for any regulation, all right? And so that's what we'll talk about briefly today. Okay, so what is compliance promotion? I mean, compliance promotion can be defined as increasing awareness of and facilitating compliance with law and regulation amongst those who would otherwise wish to comply. Remember some of the examples I gave you of the tendency for some cultures to nurture or to garner high levels of voluntary compliance with law and regulation, and that can be related to a number of different things like culture, education, and so on. But also one of the things that it certainly does reflect is that there are efforts to ensure ongoing compliance and compliance promotion. I've mentioned the term before to you, the compliance promotion and enforcement plans that need to be there for most regulations within government. So the one way of learning what those are, as I told you before, download the CEPA, Compliance Promotion and Enforcement Plan, and you will be able to see what is in there. And in those documents those are public documents, and in those documents is that everything that the government will do to help a regulated party to comply with the regulation. All right, so what we're going to talk about today are just some of those things, but more detail can be found in those types of documents, all right? And promoting compliance is necessary and effective way to ensure conformity with the law. A lot of countries around the world might have good regulations. They might put the regulations on the books, but they fall down on compliance, promotion, and enforcement, right? In particular, they fall down on compliance promotion first, and then there is none of the infrastructure or none of the capacity to actually advance enforcement. And so the regulation stays on the books, but nothing substantive really happens with that regulation. So as compared to enforcement, voluntary consent to regulations is always the preferred outcome, as we've said before, all right? By comparison, enforcement actions are relatively more expensive and risky for the regulator, right? Just because you take a party to court doesn't mean that the regulator is going to come out on top, or it doesn't mean that there isn't going to be costs associated with that in terms of public brand, in terms of risk to the minister of the department, and in other areas. There can be problems can arise, all right? And the other thing to keep in mind is that with high levels of compliance promotion and high levels of voluntary compliance, all of these things can be going on without much public profile at all. They're going on every day in a number of different areas, and they're just functioning as operational practices. So there's no need to be involved in high-profile actions, enforcement actions. Now, that having been said, when an enforcement action is taken, it's usually taken not only to bring a company into correction with a regulation, but it's also done in a high-profile way to set an example. For example, with Volkswagen's Dieselgate, for example, would be a classic case of that, all right? So thus, enforcement is always a necessary stick for any regulation, right? Regulators typically put considerable effort into compliance promotion strategies in order to avoid the necessity of going for complex and risky and noisy enforcement actions. So for compliance promotion to be effective, high levels of public legitimacy in the regulatory design and implementation process is essential. And we've discussed this extensively in the first half of the course, obviously. So during implementation, this, regulators want to ensure that stakeholders feel confident about these things. Compliance with regulations is mandatory for all regulated parties, and I think you can imagine why that is essential for high levels of voluntary compliance, right? I mean, if my neighbor is complying, I feel more inclined to comply. If I find out my neighbor isn't complying, why should I be complying? And that creates problems. So consistency in the application of regulation is absolutely essential for high levels of voluntary compliance, all right? The regulation will be applied in a manner that is fair, predictable, and consistent. In other words, there won't be changing of the rules mid-flight, right, that aren't formally approved, right? There will be a consistent, fair, and predictable application of the law. And so regulatory systems have to be set up to ensure that that takes place, all right? That we do have mechanisms that can be checked systematically to ensure that the regulation is applied fairly, predictably, and consistently. Okay, all actions to implement the regulations are founded in law and established practice. That ties directly to the question of public legitimacy, right? That everybody understands, where the rules originated, for what reason, what harm is being addressed, and that there was a legitimate, transparent process to determine that this was the regulatory design that could address the harm at the lowest cost possible. All right, and that's a very important issue for compliance promotion, that industries see that that's the case, or other regulated parties see that that's the case. They may not like the outcome, but if they see the transparent process was followed and it's based on solid expertise and information, they might be kicking the can up the road and grumbling, but they're going to come into compliance. All right, if you're being successful, they will still come into compliance at a very high rate. Regulators will manage implementation of regulations with an emphasis on preventing transgressions first, but enforcement if necessary. By this I mean that a lot of compliance promotion strategies will accept that mistakes will be made by regulated parties. Misunderstandings will occur amongst regulated parties. So mechanisms must be in place to help bring these companies back into compliance through cooperation processes or agreements or simply mutual understandings and trust to bring and working together on compliance plans or whatever that company might need to come back into compliance. So the first step is not to jump automatically into enforcement, but to seek ways to bring a company back into compliance through these other types of mechanisms of discussion. What is the problem? How can we help you fix it? Now, can you give us a plan as to when you're going to come back into compliance? This type of language, rather than moving automatically to enforcement, right? Because it's always, if you have a client that's made a mistake, or they lapsed, or they had some bad judgment, maybe we'll let that one go, but it's not a pattern of being in non-compliance, then it's always in the regulator's interest to try to bring that party into compliance through these other, what we would call softer mechanisms, rather than moving to full on-board enforcement, okay? Regulators will put in place reporting mechanisms for regulated parties. Those are absolutely essential because, high levels of voluntary compliance is one thing, but that needs to be validated, right? It needs to be validated by inspections. It needs to be validated by reporting mechanisms from regulated parties, providing the regulator with information about their level of compliance, whether that be monitoring data or whatever is required by that particular regulation, right? Trust but verify is essentially what the common phrase used in compliance promotion here, all right? But we're always trying to do that with, minimizing unnecessary red tape, right? We know that about regulation. We're trying to do it in a way that the reporting, yes, but not unnecessarily excessive reporting, right? These types of issues also enhance compliance, because if the complying party knows that what they're reporting on is essential, they're more likely to do it and do it consistently and on time and so on. If they feel that the reporting or other types of compliance hurdles are abusive, you're going to get more tendency to shirk compliance responsibilities, right? So there's an incentive for the regulator to keep that red tape under control, all right? Regulators will monitor implementation carefully, and all suspected violations of regulations will be treated according to clearly established rules of procedure. All right, and that's in compliance promotion and enforcement procedures and plans, right? It'll tell you exactly. So get that SEPA one. It'll tell you exactly what will happen if the government is providing you with some warnings on coming into compliance, and what happens if you do not comply. And those rules need to be very, very clear. They need to be very, very clear to the regulated party, because then everybody understands what will happen if they do not comply as according to the rules, right? Leave no doubt that, oh yes, if we don't comply, they won't really do anything. Well, actually, it says here they really will. So, don't start drifting off in that kind of a mindset. Stay with voluntary compliance. And that's what you're trying to do as a regulator, create that clarity, right? So that everybody understands what compliance involves, and everybody understands what non-compliance is going to involve. And when the rules are clear, there's a tendency for higher levels of voluntary compliance, right? Regulators will encourage reporting of suspected violations of regulations by regulated parties and the general public. Most compliance promotion and enforcement policies will have that feature. They will enable third parties to basically report non-compliance. All right, and that's a very important ingredient, because that engages the public in the entire process. Okay. And there's a number of things that regulators do and regulatory compliance programs do to foster compliance outside, the compliance promotion and enforcement rules of procedure. There are, various actions that you do to help regulated parties stay in compliance, okay? Regulators can promote compliance through a wide range of initiatives, right? Some provide education programs, training programs for industry, communicate and publish information through all stages of the regulation life cycle, guidance documents, training programs, newsletters, whatever the nature of the regulation is, to keep regulated parties up to speed as to what's going on. Keep them informed, keep them engaged, keep them aware that the rules that I just laid out previously are still in effect. Everybody's being treated the same. People are in compliance. These kinds of things, to ensure that everybody says, okay, well, everybody seems to be doing it, seems to be well organized. I can get help if I need it. All those things are going to enhance compliance, right? It's common human nature. It's common sense. It's human nature, right? Promote technology development and evaluation. Lots of regulations are reinforced by programs like that, right? If you're trying to come into compliance, let's say with greenhouse gas emissions, the government can enter into cooperation agreements with industry associations and others to work together to promote technology development and evaluation that enables industry to more easily comply, right? And sometimes regulatory compliance activities will encourage technology transfer and sharing, right? For some of the big guys, the big multinationals in the sector may be encouraged to share some of their knowledge and capacity with smaller players. Okay, and this kind of thing, and that earns goodwill with government by the bigger players, right? And there are different ways that can be done. Okay, and it's done heavily in developing countries. When you have large international multinationals move into a developing country, and they're often pressured by the developing country to, can you help our small and medium-sized enterprises out in dealing with their water runoff problem? Can you show them how your technology works and all that? That's not going to greatly impact the competitiveness of the big guy, but it's going to show a lot of goodwill, right, to environmental protection or whatever, through working with the small and medium-sized enterprises. You see that through organizations like the Confederation of Indian Industry in India, for example, where I did a lot of work in that area with the leather and textile sector. Getting experience from the big guys and trying to share it with the smaller guys. And these kinds of things. The Tata Steel does that in a lot of areas. Tata Consulting does that in a lot of areas. So there's different ways that these types of things occur. Then there's usually a call-in center for most regulations, right? They provide technical assistance via call-in, email, or website guidance mechanisms. So if you don't know how to fill out your compliance form, or if you don't know you're doing the right job on your reporting form for use and disposal of chemicals or whatever, there's usually a hotline or a contact point you could call up and say, I'm not really sure whether we're doing this the right way. And that's essential for good compliance, right? Sort of one-stop shopping on answering questions to come into compliance with the regulation. All good regulatory organizations will have that, all right? Consult with the public about regulation development and review. You need to be able to ensure people that when regulations are going to be reviewed, they're going to be reviewed openly, transparently. There's going to be real data there on who's complying and who isn't, what levels of compliance. So again, people will see those things and say, okay, well, there's high level of voluntary compliance, so I'm not the only one sucking up the cost for complying. So everybody's playing, it's a level playing field. Okay, that's going to keep high levels of voluntary compliance in place, right? And of course, publishing guidelines, codes of practice, conducting training workshops, as I said, is a very common practice to enhance compliance promotion. And we foster compliance audits. Sometimes companies who are unsure that they are in compliance and want the government to actually work with them to do a compliance audit. They're just unsure that they're doing everything right. And so sometimes the government will enter into arrangements to do compliance audits with large companies. They're not prosecutorial in any sense. It's just the company saying, I need to have my organization looked at for these 10 regulations. I mean, are we doing everything right? Can we arrange some kind of a compliance audit with you guys, and can we check it out, right? And these kinds of things can be arranged too in those kind of exceptional circumstances. Typically in complex compliance environments, those can be used. Okay. And you already know about Canada Gazette Parts 1 and 2 and the role that plays regarding informing stakeholders. Those are very important. So stakeholders are informed all along in the development of the regulation. Then they're informed all along in the compliance, promotion, and enforcement of that regulation. Those types of things are always going to enhance voluntary compliance to a great degree. All right? So this is a short lecture, but I want you to get a sense, and I want you to look at the Compliance, Promotion, and Enforcement Policy of CEPA and take a good look at it and scan through it and look at the various components about what it tells the regulated party will happen in terms of supporting them in compliance promotion, but also in terms of what will happen to them in terms of enforcement, all right, if they don't voluntarily comply, okay? On that score, I'll let you go, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye now.